In those days, when there was no king in Israel, there was a certain Levi living on the far side of the Ephraim hills who took a woman from Bethlehem in Yehuda to be his concubine. But his concubine was unfaithful to him and left him to go to her father's house at Bethlehem in Yehuda, where she stayed for some time, 4 months. Then her husband went out after her to persuade her to return. He had his servant with him and a pair of donkeys. She brought him into her father's house, and when the girl's father saw him, he was glad to meet him. His father-in-law and the girl's father kept him there. So he remained with him 3 days. They ate, drank, and stayed there. On the 4th day, they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to leave. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "You'll feel better if you eat a bite of food before you leave." So the two of them sat down and ate and drank together. Then the girl's father said to them, "Please, stay one more night. Have a good time." The man rose to leave, but his father-in-law pressed him, so he stayed there again. The morning on the 5th day, he got up early to leave, but the girl's father said, "Why don't you have something to eat? Leave this afternoon." So the two men ate. When the man got up to leave with his concubine and servant, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Look, it's almost evening. Please, stay the night. You see that it's getting late. Stay on, enjoy yourself. Tomorrow get up early and be on your way." But the man wouldn't stay that night. So he got up and left with his concubine and his 2 saddle donkeys, and they arrived at Uvis, also known as Jerusalem. By the time they arrived in Uvis, it was nearly evening. The servant said to his master, "Why don't we go into the city of Uvisi, and stay there?" But his master said to him, "We won't go into a city of foreigners which doesn't belong to the people of Israel. We'll go on across to the Giva." He said to his servant, "Let's go. We'll go to one of those places. We'll stay in Giva or Ramah." So they went on and kept traveling until the sun set on them near Giva, which belongs to Benjamin. There they turned off the road to go on to stay at Giva. He went in and sat down in the city's open spaces, since no one had offered his home to them to spend the night. In time at nightfall, an old man came from his work in the field. He was from Ephraim Hills and was staying at Giva, although the residents were of Benjamin. The old man looked up, saw the travel in the city's open spaces, and said, "Where are you going, and where are you coming from?" He replied, "We're crossing from Bethlehem in Yehuda to the far side of the Ephraim Hills. That's where I'm from. I went to Bethlehem in Yehuda, and now I'm going to the house of Adonai. But there's no one here who will let me spend the night in his home. We have straw and food for our donkeys, also bread and wine for me and my concubine and the boy there with your servants. We don't need anything else." The old man said, "You're welcome to stay with me. I'll take care of anything you lack. Just don't spend the night in the open." So he brought him home and gave food for the donkeys. Then they washed their feet, ate, and drank. They were relaxing when suddenly some men came from the city, good-for-nothings, surrounded the house and began beating at the door. "Send out the man who came home with you," they demanded of the old man whose house it was. "We want to have sex with him." The man whose house it was went out and said to them, "No, my brothers, please don't do anything as wrong as this. Look, he's just a guest in my house. Don't do this degrading thing. Here's my daughter, who's a virgin, and his concubine. I'll bring them out to mistreat them. Do what you want to them, but don't do such a degrading thing to this man." However, the man wouldn't listen to him. So the men took hold of his concubine and brought her out to them. They raped her and abused her all night long. Only at dawn did they let her go. At daybreak, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her husband was, and she was there when it grew light. When her husband got up, he opened the door of the house and went out to go his way. He saw the woman lying there with her hands stretched out toward the door. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. So he loaded her body on the donkey and began his trip home. On arriving at his house, he got a knife, took hold of his concubine's body, cut her up into 12 pieces and sent them to all the regions of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, "From the day the people of Israel came out from Egypt until now, never has such a thing happened or been seen. What are we going to do about it? Talk it over and decide." All the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, including Gilad. The community assembled with one accord before Adonai at Mitzpah. The leaders and all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers armed with swords. Now the people of Benjamin heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mitzpah. The people of Israel said, "Tell us, how was this crime committed?" Levi, the husband, the murdered woman, answered, "I came to Giva, which belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to stay the night. The men of Giva attacked me and surrounded the house I was staying at that night. They wanted to kill me, but instead they raped my concubine to death. I took my concubine's body, cut it into pieces, and sent it out through all the territory belonging to Israel, because they committed a shockingly obscene and degrading crime in Israel. Look, we're all the people of Israel, so discuss what to do. Give your advice here and now." All the people stood up in agreement and said, "None of us will go home to his tent or his house. What we will do now to Giva is this: we'll draw lots. We'll take 10 men of each 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 out of 1,000, and 1,000 out of 10,000 to collect the food for the others. When these tribes came to Giva and Benjamin, they will avenge the crime that was committed." Thus all the men of Israel joined together in complete agreement, assembled to attack the city. The tribes of Israel sent men throughout all the tribes of Benjamin with this message: "What is this crime committed by some of your people? Turn over these good-for-nothings who are in Giva at once, so that we can execute them and rid Israel of such evil." But the people of Benjamin refused to obey the order of their kinsmen of the people of Israel. Instead, the people gathered themselves together from their cities and went to Giva to fight the people of Israel. On that day were 26,000 men from Benjamin armed with swords, besides the inhabitants of Giva, who numbered 700 specially chosen men. All of these 700 specially picked men were left-handed, and every one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. The army of Israel, apart from Benjamin, numbered 400,000 men with swords. They were all experienced soldiers. The army of Israel began going up to Beit El, where they asked God, "Who should go up first to attack the army of Benjamin?" Adonai said, "Yehuda first." So the army of Israel got up in the morning and set up their camp near Giva. Then the army of Israel went out to attack Benjamin and set up their battle line in front of Giva. But the army of Benjamin came out of Giva and slaughtered the army of Israel on that day. 22,000 men fell. The men of Israel restored their morale and again positioned themselves for battle where they had been the first day. Then the army of Israel went up and cried before Adonai until evening. They asked Adonai, "Should we attack our kinsmen, the people of Benjamin, again?" Adonai answered, "Attack them." So the army of Israel went out to attack the army of Benjamin the second day. But Benjamin went out against them from Giva the second day and slaughtered the army of Israel. 18,000 men armed with swords fell. And the whole army of Israel, all the people, went up to Beit El and cried and sat there in the presence of Adonai. They fasted that day until evening, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings to Adonai. They asked Adonai what to do. The Ark of the Covenant of God was there at that time, and Pekah, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, stood before it at that time. They asked, "Should we still go out to battle against our kinsmen, the people of Benjamin, or should we stop?" Adonai answered, "Attack, because tomorrow I'll hand them over to you." Israel hid some men around Giva, and on the third day of Israel attacked the army of Benjamin and took possession against Giva as they had other times. Again the army of Benjamin went out against the people, lured away from the city. they began attacking and killing some of the people as they had the other times. They killed about 30 men of Israel in the countryside and on the roads, one of which goes up to Beth El and the other to Giva. The army of Benjamin said, "They're defeated, just as before." But the army of Israel said, "Let's run off and draw them away from the city under the roads." All the men of Israel left their places and took up battle position at Baal Tamar. While the other Israel men burst out of their hiding places at Mira Giva. 10,000 men chosen out of all Israel came over to attack Giva. The combat was intense, but the army of Benjamin didn't know what they were about. They were about to be defeated, for Adonai routed Benjamin in Israel's presence. That day the army of Israel destroyed 21,100 men of Benjamin, all of whom carried swords. The people of Benjamin realized that they had been beaten. The men of Israel trusted the ones they had put in place to ambush Benjamin, gave ground to the men of Benjamin. Then the men who had been lying in wait rushed in on Giva, drew their swords to destroy the city. The army of Israel and the ambushers had agreed that the signal they would make was huge cloud of smoke rise from the city, at which time the men of Israel would turn back. When that happened, Benjamin began to attack. They killed about 30 of Israel's men and said, "Clearly we're defeating them again, as in the first battle." But when the smoke signal began rising from the city, the men of Benjamin looked behind them and saw the whole city going up to the sky in smoke. Then the men of Israel reversed direction. Those of Benjamin were overcome with terror. When they saw the disaster had come upon them, they turned their backs on the men of Israel and made for the road to the desert. But the battle followed them, and those who came out of the city destroyed them from the rear. They surrounded the men of Benjamin. Chased them, and trampled them down across Giva on the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them experienced soldiers. They turned and fled toward the desert, the rock of Rimmon, and 5,000 of them were killed on the roads. They followed them of Gidom and killed another 2,000. Thus the total number of Benjamin who fell that day was 25,000 experienced sword-bearing soldiers. But 600 turned and fled toward the desert to the rock of Rimmon. They lived there 4 months. The men of Israel turned back on the people of Benjamin and killed them with the sword, the entire city, the cattle and everything they found. Moreover, they set on fire the cities they encountered. The men of Israel had sworn to Mitzpah that none of them would let his daughter marry a man from Benjamin. The people came to Beth El and stayed there before God till evening, crying and weeping. They said, "Adonai, why has this come about in Israel? Why should there be today in Israel one tribe missing?" The next day the people got up early, built an altar, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. The people of Israel asked, "Who among the tribes of Israel did not come up to assemble before Adonai?" For they had made a great oath to put to death whoever didn't come up to Adonai at Mitzpah. The people of Israel became sorry for Benjamin, their brother, and said, "Today one tribe has been cut off from Israel. How are we going to obtain wives for those who remain alive, since we've sworn by Adonai that we won't let our daughters marry them?" Then they asked who from the tribe of Israel had not come up to Adonai at Mitzpah, and found that none had come from Yavesh Gilad to the camp where the assembly was. Since when the people were counted, none of the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilad were found there. So the gathering sent 12,000 warriors there and ordered them, "Go, put the people who live in Yavesh Gilad to death with the sword, including women and children. Completely destroy every man and every woman who had sex with a man." Among the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilad, they found 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with them, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole gathering sent a message proclaiming peace to the people of Benjamin, who were at the rock of Rimmon. So Benjamin returned at that time to the people of Israel, gave them the women who had kept alive of the women from Yavesh Gilad. But those made a division among the tribes of Israel. But those weren't enough for them. the people were still sorry for Benjamin because Adonai had made a division among the tribes of Israel. The leaders of the assembly asked, "What are we to do for those who still don't have wives, inasmuch as all the women of Benjamin have been killed?" They said, "There is to be a way to help the survivors preserve Benjamin's inheritance, so that a tribe will not be eliminated from Israel. Yet we can't give them our daughters as wives." For the people of Israel had sworn, "Cursed by whoever gives a wife to Benjamin." Then they said, "Look, each year there's a festival in honor of Adonai in Shiloh, north of Bet-El, on the east side of the road that goes up from Bet-El to Shechem, on the south of Levanah." They ordered the men of Benjamin, "Go, hide in the vineyards and keep watch. If the girls in Shiloh come out their dances, then come out of the vineyards, and each of you catch for himself a wife from the Shiloh girls, and go on to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, 'Give them as a personal favor to us, because we didn't take wives for each of them in battle. For you don't give them to them. That would have made you guilty of breaking an oath.' So the men of Benjamin did this. They took wives for themselves from the girls who were dancing, as many as they needed. They carried them off, went back to the land of their inheritance, and rebuilt the cities and lived in them. The people of Israel then left that place. Each man returned to his tribe and family, and each man went out from there to the land he had inherited. At that time there was no king in Israel. A man simply did whatever he thought was right.